Jason enters the play as a medical student of Dr. Kalikian's. He's a fellow. Now, he is a doctor and he's going to be Vivian's doctor, but you have to understand that this hospital is a teaching hospital. It's full of students who have their medical degrees but still need to do their, what we call in the States, their internships. And so while he's still studying under Dr. Kalikian and doing his research under Dr. Kalikian, he is Vivian's main doctor. There's something, I mean, he's probably in his mid late 20s. There's something about him that, for people my age, makes him seem kind of like a kid and kind of unsure of himself. But that's where we sort of begin here. Um, he's very nervous, but he knows Vivian Baring because when he was an undergraduate, he used to be one of her students. We learn a little bit about his character. He likes to challenge himself. He took the three hardest classes on campus. But there are things that he says which are just sort of comically naive. He tells Vivian that he's going to take her history and then give her an exam. The first pun is with the word exam, which now has multiple layers of meaning. It's the thing that Vivian gave to Jason when he was her student, and now he's going to give one to her. Although it's a different thing. When he says exam, he means, of course, a physical examination. But it is arduous nonetheless. Jason asks a lot of stupid questions. For example, how is your general health? Well, she has stage 4 cancer, but Vivian answers fine, and that's what Jason writes down, and that's sort of the end of it. But he also asks her personal questions like, how old are you? Do you use drugs? Um, and this is Vivian talking to one of her students, having to answer these sort of personal questions and probing questions. Like when Jason asks Vivian, do you use PCP? It must just be sort of like an affront to her, but she just answers him directly and it keeps going. He asks about the death of her parents, and it turns out that her mother died of cancer. Cancer is genetic, and that's the only thing in her life history that interests him. But at the end, he only asks about 5 or 6 very general questions, and then he says, and I think this is funny, well, that about does it for your life history. This was 30 seconds of the play. And Vivian replies a bit with a tiny little bit of sarcasm that I'm sure Jason doesn't register with Jason. Yes, that's all there is to my life history. Something about Jason and Vivian's dialogue that should remind you a little bit of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, or, if you've read it in other class, Waiting for Godot. It's this very rapid back and forth bop, bop, bop like tennis. Um, he asks questions. All of Vivian's answers are very brief. Um, and, he asks her if she's ever had cancer. Of course, she's had cancer now. Um, but this dialogue goes on, and then as soon as it ends, of course, Vivian breaks the fourth wall and immediately goes to telling the audience about it. While she is lying there in stirrups waiting to be examined, Vivian begins by saying her times tables to herself. This is something that I used to do. I think I still do this. Um, when you're in a real stressful situation, but you're also just waiting, you go over something that you've memorized. She only does that for a few seconds and then she switches and she starts reciting Death Be Not Proud. It's something that she knows by heart, and it gives her it gives her some solace to be able to think about something other than the fact where she is and what she's actually really doing. She's purposely making her mind go somewhere else. But in doing that, she also has to have a really concentrated thought about the nature of death. And she says the last line of the poem like this, and death shall be no more, comma, death thou shalt die. Remember, that's the way E.M. Ashford told her the poem should go. But that's going to change by the end of the play. Examination itself must have been absolutely humiliating for Vivian. It adds to the indignity of it because it was a former student of hers. She uses the word degrading. And while she's breaking the fourth wall, oh, that obviously the word degrading is a pun here. But while she's breaking the fourth wall, she says, with ellipses in between the words, that was hard. That was, and then she pauses and she says, one thing can be said for an 8-month course in cancer treatment. It is highly educational. I am learning to suffer. I think that's a big part of what this play is about. I think human suffering is an important theme. And I think it's also quite honestly a big part of what tragedy is about. We watch our tragic heroes, and in this case, I think Vivian Baring is one. We watch them suffer, and we watch how they face and endure their suffering. There is a scene when Vivian is throwing up, and while she is throwing up, she says redundantly or repeatedly, "Oh God." Now, you can think of that on a surface level as being an interjection. It's what I say when I hit my thumb with a hammer, or when I'm in pain, or quite frankly, when I'm throwing up, that's what I say. And it's not really a prayer. But on another level, you can think of this as Vivian calling to God in her moment of suffering. There is sort of that duality to this scene, which is very base and very raw and very human, watching someone throw up. As soon as she's done, she actually makes a series of jokes. One about she plays with the words barf her brains out. She touches on the idea that that might be literal. And she says something funny about how her vocabulary has taken a turn for the Anglo-Saxon. Those are the more Germanic and less romantic versions of English, where you have more guttural sounds. Um, but we know that this is actually a process that she's been through many, many times. She's able to accurately guess how many cc's of vomit she has produced. And she says in a very witty line to Susie the nurse, "It was very hard work." Anyway, this is about suffering, and it is about a realistic portrayal of what is happening to her. We also have Vivian breaking the fourth wall and showing us what it's really like most of the time. She just lies there in silence. Now, this again should really remind you of Waiting for Godot and the influences there, but Margaret Edson doesn't carry this as far as Samuel Beckett. She doesn't really make her audience wait more than a minute or two. And she even makes a joke about the fact that she's doing that. She says, brevity is the soul of wit. And when she says that, of course, she's quoting Polonius from Hamlet. Grand rounds refers to the students going around from patient to patient throughout the hospital with Dr. Kalikian, where they're being tested and quizzed on treatments and procedures and diseases and things like that. And they get to Vivian, and they don't even, Jason has to be reminded to address her like she's a human being. And when he leaves, he has to be reminded that, to say something nice to her or recognize her humanity. It's just not something he normally does. This play is going to have little bits about Jason and his connection to research rather than his connection to people, and that actually is what makes him a foil for Vivian. But at the end of this play, Jason is going to change, and Vivian's death is going to inspire that change. I think that's going to be one of the most important parts of the play. So Vivian plays with the idea that grand rounds aren't really all that grand. Again, it's another just pun off of the word grand. But after they leave, she starts to have flashbacks to her childhood. and she starts to remember back to when she first started reading and first started learning new words.